When we talk about camera settings, we usually think about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. But what if I told you that ND filters have become the most important camera settings when it comes to exposure? In fact, none of the other settings should really play a role when exposing your shots. Let's dive right in. Now, why would I make such a bold claim? Or is it even a bold claim? Like, some of you may have experienced the exact same thing and are agreeing that variable ND filters is really the most important tool today. And some of you may still think I'm completely out of my mind. But the reality is I can only share with you my experience. And I've been in the industry since 2004, creating video content for all kind of different clients throughout the United States. And I've seen the industry and the technology evolved from your traditional broadcast cameras to then moving towards the DSLR technology, the mirrorless technology, and then the introduction of dual native ISO, which I really believe that's the biggest advancement that we're seeing in our equipment today is in the sensor technology. And I believe it's going to continue to evolve drastically and already completely change the way we work, but will continue to change in the future. So how we are exposing today is very different than how we exposed 4, 5, 6 years ago, and it will be completely different on how we expose in the future. The introduction of dual native ISO completely changed the way we actually look at ISO. Today, shooting in native means that our cameras are operating at the optimum settings, where we have the most dynamic range with the least amount of grain. And so it's very attractive to stay in native ISO. And shooting on the Sony FX6, it's not easy to change ISO. You actually have to go into the menu and change the shooting mode to then get flexible ISO that you can adjust. So 99% of the time, I don't deviate from native ISO. And it removes that as a camera settings to control exposure. It's just no longer a factor because 99% of the time, I know I'm going to shoot at ISO 800. And so it just removes itself from the equation of exposure. The next advancement that really changed my perspective of ISO and how I operate is the introduction of Sony RAW within DaVinci Resolve. So a few updates ago, DaVinci introduced Sony RAW. And it kind of blew my mind in the beginning because I was taught when I purchased the Sony FX6, that was my introduction to Cine EI. And I was taught that an exposure index, the EI, was something that you could adjust and will not impact the footage that you record. It will only make the monitor brighter or darker so that it would force you to overexpose or underexpose based on your situation. It was also a great tool to show your client. So if you're shooting a dark scene and your client was complaining that it's too dark, you could simply change the EI setting and all of a sudden their monitor looks a lot brighter and they're happy. But we know we're capturing a darker scene that way. And so that's what I was taught. And it was accurate and true for a long time until Sony RAW was introduced to DaVinci Resolve, where now DaVinci uses the metadata of the EI setting as your exposure settings. And I actually was really shocked because I was doing a test at the time and I just kept recording and I would switch my EI setting and while recording. And when I put it into DaVinci and I played it back, I saw my exposure changed every time I switch the EI setting. And I remember calling a friend of mine and be like, hey, am I not understanding something? I thought this was not recorded. I thought it was just applying brightness into the monitor, but not to the footage. And he hadn't experienced that either. That was our first time being introduced to the fact that DaVinci now uses the metadata of the EI setting as the setting for exposure in DaVinci, meaning we can now change our exposure, our ISO, in post-production, just like the RED cameras. The REDs, you can set your ISO in the camera, but it doesn't change how the camera captures the footage. It's only a metadata that's used in post-production so that you can set your ISO after the fact. And really, those two advancements, native ISO and Sony RAW in DaVinci, completely change how we expose today. And so I have the ability to then use ISO however I want in post-production. So you may ask, well, what's the point of ISO? What is it for then, if really you don't need to worry about it and you can just adjust it in post-production? Well, if we look at the charts provided by the camera manufacturers on their dynamic range, and that goes for pretty much every camera manufacturers, whether it's Sony, whether it's Red, whether it's Arri, Blackmagic, Canon, whatever equipment you're working with, you can look at their published dynamic range chart, and it will clearly show you that the only purpose of ISO is when you adjust your ISO setting, it is designed to shift the dynamic range to give you more or less stops in the shadows or in the highlights. And so I'm going to stick with the Sony because that's what I work with. But again, here are the charts for all the other manufacturers, and they all pretty much operate the same way. You have your native, where you can see that this is the optimum as far as the number of stops in the shadows and the highlights. You can clearly see that if I switch my EI to a certain level, then it allows me to have more stops in the shadows and less stops in the highlights. And if I adjust it up from native, then I have more stops in the highlights and less stops in the shadows. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this, I have a full video. I'll put the link in the description below. This is a video that a lot of people commented on, a lot of opinions, a lot of people were excited about the technology. Some people thought I was completely crazy. What I would encourage you to do is not only do your own research, but test your equipment. And before I present things to you, I do my own testing. And so, take it for whatever you want. This is my observation, my experience. This is what I see. And this is what I read when I read this chart. So, when I did the test in the shadows, moving my EI setting below native, which we called negative ISO. So shooting negative ISO, my test showed very clearly that the amount of noise in the shadows was significantly lower than at native ISO. And so that's the role of ISO today. It's not at all to brighten an image. It is really for us to use depending on the scene that we're about to shoot. So if I know that I'm filming a darker scene, I can shoot negative ISO, set my EI below native, and I'm going to get more stops in the shadow, which is going to result in significantly less noise in the shadows. And the opposite is true. So if I'm shooting in a very bright environment, I can now set my EI to a higher setting than native, and it will result in me having more latitude in the highlights. So with that being said, I also experience a lot of my peers that are my age, that have been in the industry for a long time, being left behind because they hold on to this traditional view of ISO, and it's completely outdated. And so if you treat ISO the same way that you were treating it a couple years ago or a few years ago, you're going to be left behind. And I literally have seen outstanding DPs who have worked in the industry for actually longer than I have, 25, 35 years, do some really, really bad jobs, like shots very grainy, really poor quality, simply because they did not take the time to learn this new technology and the advancements that's being made in the sensor space. And like I said earlier, I really believe that that's where it's going to continue to grow. And we need to be ready as cinematographers to continue to learn in that particular space, to continue to learn the advancement of sensor technology, because in a few years, we're going to be talking about exposure in a whole new different way, because more and more of that approach, as far as not having things completely printed on the sensor, meaning the flexibility to adjust your setting in post-production, is going to continue to get better and better and better. So again, I would encourage you to continue to learn, continue to do your own research, continue to test your equipment, especially if you're a DP or want to be a DP. That's our job, is to understand the need for that particular camera. How is that particular sensor how is that particular sensor needed to be exposed to light in order to produce the best quality images? That's our job. Yes, we need to understand lighting. We need to be able to understand how to continue to manipulate light and ratios. But if I don't understand how that particular camera translates light signals into electrical current and what levels that sensor needs to be exposed to, I will never be able to produce high quality footage. So that's my encouragement in us continue to learn together. And so I welcome all your comments for sure as far as your equipment, what you've experienced, but I will again encourage you to do your own testing and continue to grow as well. So what about aperture and shutter speed? Because in my opening, I said those settings should also not be really part of the equation for exposure. And I really believe that's true. Like, I was not trying to make an outrageous statement just to get you guys to watch this video. Aperture and shutter speed are creative tools, not exposure settings. They're here in order for you to then create the image that you want to create. Aperture will give us shallow depth of field. Shutter speed will give us motion blur. And we need to make those settings decisions based on the creative directions that we're trying to achieve. So I understand that a lot of us have had to make some compromise to say, I want a very shallow depth of field and I want a somewhat slow shutter speed, but I'm overexposed. And so I have to manipulate the two, balance the two in order to get the right amount of light onto my sensor. But that's the wrong approach, because now we're compromising the creative side of things. And that's where variable ND filters really come into play, because with access to variable ND filters, I no longer have to compromise. I can do a fully open aperture with a slow shutter. And all I need to do is raise my variable ND filters to then balance the exposure of my image. So again, aperture and shutter speed are really just creative tools, and ND filters is a real exposing tool, a real setting designed specifically to limit the amount of light coming into the sensor. It has no other purposes. Like, that's the only thing ND filters do, is limit the amount of light coming into the sensor. So that's a true exposure tool. Now, I can only go back to my own equipment, which is behind me, the Sony FX6. Again, I'm not sponsored by Sony. I'm not paid by anybody to talk about anything. I can only talk about the equipment that I use. So the Sony FX6 came with a built-in electronic variable ND filter that's also seamless and stopless, meaning I have a wheel that I can move up and down, and it seamlessly, gradually gets darker and darker, adds more ND filter. And it also has an auto function. And if you're interested in learning more about how to use the auto function, I also have a video available where I show you 2 different case studies on how I use the auto function. One during an interview setting where we had a big window in the background and the light constantly was changing because of clouds. And by switching it to auto, then the camera was able to adjust the level of ND and kept my exposure correct without affecting my depth of field, for example. And the other example of me using the auto ND filters is doing a time lapse from daytime to nighttime, where you can set it on auto, and as the night comes in, then less ND is being applied, and you can do those nice transition between daytime and nighttime. So go check those out. I'll put the link in the description as well. Traditionally, ND filters were kind of like an actual glass, an actual filter like this one that you would screw on in front of your lens. And they were great. The only problem is it wasn't very practical. Like, the moment you needed something darker, you needed to remove that one, place a different one. If you change a lens, you need to change, you needed to put those ND filters back on it. So here's a darker version. And so you would just constantly have to replace them or adjust them as you change location or change your shot. With the introduction of variable ND filters, we were able to then eliminate that problem, make it a lot easier by simply rotating the variable ND filters to get a denser and denser filter without having to replace it. With onboard It's actually mounted between the lens and the sensor, so I can swap lenses, no problem. And I have a very easy access to ND filters. The FX6 goes from an ND4 all the way to 128. I wish it was going further than 128. There are definitely instances where I still have to compromise because I'm trying to do something very different, very unique, and I'm bringing so much light in that even at 128 ND, I don't have enough. Now, I also have a matte box that has a variable ND filter on the front of it, so I could double stack them. But I wish the onboard was a little darker than the 128. But again, for most scenario, it's really, really perfect. Let me show you this shot. We were actually hired by a company that builds the signage for storefronts and stadiums. And they send us to capture the storefront that you see here in the middle of this crazy intersection in Beverly Hills. And it was actually very tricky to find a good shot. Like there were poles and people and cars everywhere. And the only good place where I can see the entire storefront was from across the street. So by shooting with a very slow shutter speed, I'm able to then create this ghost-like, very blurry movement from the cars and the people, which helps my viewer then be able to focus on exactly what I want them to watch, which is the storefront. And so that was only possible because we're shooting this at a shutter speed, I believe, of like 2.5 seconds. And so we're open for 2.5 seconds. We're shooting time lapse, and I have an ND filter of 128. And that's the only way that you can make this happen. I think even if I would have closed my aperture all the way, I don't think I could have exposed that shot properly. And so having that ND filters really made it possible to create those shots. Now, this technique works really well, not just for time-lapse. I actually use it on every shoot. And one of the best advantage of using ND to expose, even when you have full control of everything, is it allows me to adjust my exposure without having to recreate my lighting ratios. I can keep the same ratio and just say, oh, I need a little bit more levels, and I can just wheel up or down on my ND filters, and I will raise all the levels or lower all the levels, but the ratio between my key light, my fill light, and my background is gonna stay exactly the same. And so that becomes very valuable, especially on a very large setup. If you're working with a gaffer, for example, they're gonna be very happy with you as a DP if you're able to just say, oh man, I wish I had more level, let me just tweak this. And your gaffer doesn't have to reset all the ratios because it could take some times. I don't know if a lot of you have experience working with ratios, but basically you would go around and say, pre-shoot, say, I want a 6:1 or 8:1 ratio. And then you would ask your gaffer to create that. And so they would go around with their light meters or an EL zone system and make sure that the levels on your key side compared to your fill side is that ratio that you're asking for. And if you then say, oh, that's great, but my levels are too high, so now we need to readjust all the lighting, then he has to go back around or she has to go back around and remeasure everything, readjust all the lights to keep that ratio a little lower. No, it's the same ratio, but by lowering the intensity of the light. And so if you're able to do that with ND, people are going to love you on set. And, sometimes it could be my client, right? Like if I set everything up the way I want it with the ratios that I want, and the client comes in and is a little worried about, oh my gosh, this looks a little too dark, then I can just wheel up my ND, remove some of the ND filters, and all of a sudden it looks brighter and we didn't have to change anything. The setup is the exact same way. Or sometimes it's me. Maybe somehow I kind of misjudged it and I feel like, man, I think I'm a little too overexposed. Let me drop it down a bit and I can just wheel, add more ND, drop all the levels, keep all the same ratio, keep everything the same, and we are ready to shoot. So let me show you how I would typically set my exposure using this technique. So the first thing that I would do is I would set my shutter speed and my aperture based on the look that I want. So maybe I am wanting to shoot at a very shallow depth of field. And maybe I want a certain shutter speed in order to create the motion blur that I want. So I set those first. Then I'm going to add a certain amount of ND. And it doesn't really matter how much. I guess it depends on the equipment that you have available as far as lighting. But let's say 10. That's enough to have a few stops up or down later on. And so with my ND levels set to 10, I can now create the lighting that I want. I can turn on my key light, raise it to the levels that I want. I can expose my shot using the light and creating the ratios that I want between the key side, the fill side, and the background. Once that's all set, I'm done. But now, if I want to adjust, I can simply wheel and remove or add ND filters to get the levels that I want. That's it. It's as simple as that. I also use the exact same technique when I'm shooting B-roll in an office. A lot of my work is corporate film, where I ended up in office where I don't control a lot of the things, but using the variable ND filter has completely changed how I work for multiple reasons. One, by using this technique, I can maintain the same depth of field from shots to shots. So it's not like I'm going into a different room. I'm like, this one is brighter. Let me close my aperture a little bit, and now my depth of field is different. So by using the ND filter, I don't touch my aperture. It's set, and from shot to shot, they will look the same as far as the depth of field. For the shutter speed, the challenge working in an office has always been the scanning on the monitors, on computer monitors. And so now I can set my shutter speed to make sure I have zero scanning on those monitors. And now I control my exposure with the ND filters. And that has changed everything for me, because prior to that, it was always a compromise of using shots that were not as shallow, because I would have to set my shutter speed to match the monitor. So I didn't have that scanning. But then all I could do was close my aperture to then expose the shot, and I would lose that depth of field. Today, I can have very shallow depth of field, no scanning on monitors, and all I need to do is adjust my ND filter. And when I go to a different room, I leave the camera exactly the same, and all I do is quickly change my ND filters up or down based on the exposure of that room, and I'm ready to go. If you want to have full control over your exposure and not compromise on your creative vision, you need to start looking at variable ND filter as the most important tool that you have at your disposal. Thank you for watching this video until the end. As a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you my free camera setting cheat sheet. Just follow the link below to download your free cheat sheet. Thanks again, and happy filming.